Thank you for the great turnout, and I'm really excited to have two friends and colleagues of mine who were at the International Studies Association meeting up in Toronto. And for a long time, I've wanted to be able to get them to come down to Syracuse University, and it worked out in this case because they're just a few hours above the border. So let me do some introductions first. First, I want to introduce Lutz Krebs. And Lutz, a German political scientist by training, and to me sort of personifies some of the challenges that we've been dealing with in our department of thinking about political science, public administration, public policy, and international relations. And so Lutz's training, he's got 2 masters and in political science and economics, and some work on humanitarian assistance. And his PhD is from ETH in Zurich, so one of the finest institutions in the world, and a very demanding environment. And I've known Lutz now over the past several years because of my connection to the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance, because Lutz teaches in that program and is all things to all students all the time there. He's an accessible person, cares a lot about teaching, but a lot of the students there have a real interest in his research area, and so nothing short of delighted to have him here. In addition, Tatiana Skripka, a Russian, also a political scientist, Lutz's wife, herself teaches at the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance, and like so many students that they have in Maastricht and that we have here, increasingly a very broad and global range of interest and perspectives. And Tatiana's area is really thinking about regional integration in the EU. She runs the regional integration specialization at Maastricht, works with a lot of the Masters of Public Policy students and the doctoral students. And so we're hoping that next year, because she's got a new book that's just about ready to come out, a really fantastic book from Palgrave in the UK. And next year they're going to be in New Orleans for the International Studies meeting, and we're hoping that we'll be able to bring them back and give Tatiana the stage to talk about her new book. And I think for us it's pretty interesting because we keep talking about the fact that public administration and public policy is becoming more and more international. And for a lot of you, you're living through this kind of merger in our program, and we're now about a year out from it, from when it went into its inception, of bringing together those different areas. And in my mind, Tatiana and Lutz represent the kind of next generation of scholars who are not just singularly embedded within a traditional discipline, but are taking a far more interdisciplinary perspective, both on theory, on literature, looking at really practical, relevant problems that are hard to address in terms of collective action issues, property rights issues, but thinking in pretty sophisticated ways about a range of methods and data, and not just exclusively quantitative or qualitative, but from the people that I've met, kind of their cohort of newer scholars being trained, especially those that are coming from a place like ETH, very multi-method. And I think as many of you can relate to, that's a perspective that we've worked hard to try to develop and institutionalize here, and certainly under David's leadership and Bill Duncombe before him and Doug Wolf, there's been a lot of focus on we're not quantitative or qualitative, we want to use the most rigorous methods to answer the questions that we're interested in. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Lutz, and I've told him that we have about 45 minutes for him to make his presentation, which will then give us about another 35 to 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion. So thanks so much for being here.
And thank you, David.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad this worked out. And next year, I promise we'll be smarter in not scheduling it at the same time as the ISA. I'm so happy that you could all make it anyway. This presentation will cover a couple of different separate pieces of research. One published article that's a little older as an entry point. Then 2 current working papers that are basically wrapped up in a new research project that we're starting just this spring. I'll try and somehow create a red line in this. I'm glad that some of you brought fruit. This is an ideal signaling mechanism to let me know if I fail, because you can throw it. The topic is, it started out as democratization and civil war and was part of a Swiss National Science Foundation equivalent, basically, project for 4 years on democracy in the 21st century and the kind of challenges that we face in trying to update this concept and in trying to spread the concept to different areas of the world and keep it relevant for different cultural backgrounds and different institutional backgrounds. The project is now has concluded about 4 years ago, and since then there's a bit of a shift in the research itself, because we're moving away from civil war more towards political violence as a broader category. And I hope towards the end it'll become clear why this is necessary. Since it's 3 or 4 different pieces of research, I think it makes sense if you have questions or comments or anything that we stop right there and deal with it as we go along. Right, so this all starts with basically Mansfield and Snyder in 1995, double article that they placed very skillfully in foreign affairs, more for the policy crowd, and in a scientific journal for the academic discussion, where they try and kind of pick up on the enthusiasm of the post-Cold War, first 5 years, the end of history kind of enthusiasm of, you know, okay, we're gonna start spreading democracy to more and more places. And their main takeaway message was we should be very careful with democratizing countries, because while democracies tend to be more peaceful, and we have good theoretical and empirical arguments for assuming this, the countries that actually democratized during this period, they have one of the highest likelihoods of civil wars. Their initial starting point wasn't even civil wars, it was even interstate wars. So during the democratization period, very high risk of conflict. And it makes sense why this would be. Because on the one hand, you're taking away the old structures, the autocratic structures. Sometimes you even have to use violence to get rid of the old autocratic regime. You can't credibly keep a lot of these structures around for reasons of trust of the population, legitimacy of the institutions. So often in one fell swoop, you take away a lot of what structures society and what generates stability. And at the same time, the new democratic institutions need time to gain the trust of the population, to gain credibility. Sometimes there's various arguments of how long this takes. Some people argue, okay, it'll take a generation or 2 before you truly have a population that is comfortable in the democratic environment, has the trust in the institutions that if something goes wrong, yes, the system will work it out. And at the same time as you're taking away the old structures, the new structures are still young, weak, and not necessarily imbued with a lot of trust from the population. You introduce a period of intense political competition. And we've seen this in many democratization cases. And there's, of course, it's a two-edged sword. You want to start elections as soon as possible so as to generate legitimacy for the new leaders. At the same time, if you make winners and losers too soon, you run the risk of alienating a share of the political landscape and a share of the population very early in the process, and therefore discouraging them from investing in the democratic structures. So this argument they've made already in '95. Since then, there's been a bunch of studies following up on this, qualitative and quantitative, and they all come back with more or less strong evidence backing up the original argument made by Mansfield and Snyder. I want to talk about 3 different things in this context. The first one is, just to get us started, a brief empirical quantitative study where we try to put the finding that democratizations have a higher risk of civil war onset on a sturdy footing. Then I'll try and move into the area of, okay, who drives this process? Why is it that this is such a risky period? And the most prominent argument here is, of course, that it's political elites who either they manipulate or at least they further the risk of violence, possibly for selfish reasons, possibly for altruistic reasons, but elites as a nexus. And I'll present a quantitative large N study where we've tried to show that political leaders, particularly an incumbent who is threatened during this period with an unpleasant fate, seem to increase the risk even further. And I'll look at a case, Burundi in 1988 to 93, basically a textbook case of trying to democratize as carefully as you could possibly do it, to show whether elites have a way of actually preventing violence. Because if we argue that elites are a significant actor in starting the violence, then they should also have a hand in preventing the violence if they are careful about it. The final step then is I'll broaden the horizon from civil war to political violence, and I'll cast a little bit of doubt on the findings that we've had so far, which we can now subject to new kinds of tests thanks to event data sets, very comprehensive event data sets that are available now, that show a slightly different pattern in the development of violence during democratization periods. Right, so the first part, as I mentioned, plenty of studies have tried to show that democratization periods are problematic in terms of civil war onsets. Many of these studies are sensitive to the behavior of the particular indicator that you use in order to figure out when something was democratized. And they're also sensitive to how you recognize that the indicator has changed enough for you to say, okay, so many points is an actual democratization. Less than that is not a democratization. So here's an overview of some of the most quoted reference studies. Gladish and Wards, Hegre and his team, Fearon, Leighton, Mansfield, and Snyder, 10 years ago, after their initial publication. They all rely on Polity4. We've tried similar studies with other indicators, and we find relatively similar results, but Polity4 remains the most frequently used indicator. They all differ by what is enough change for us to call it a democratization. For example, Hegre et al. In their 2001 paper, they say, okay, if polity changes by at least 2 points year to year, it's a democratization. This was before Jim Vreeland came around and studied the polity indicator and figured out that there is a bizarre combination of events that if you have the outbreak of factional violence, you can actually gain 2 polity points. So, actually shooting people during an election season will democratize you by 2 points in this indicator in a rare set of circumstances. But it matters because in this case, you have political violence on both sides of the equation. Fearon and Leighton have tried to sidestep that a little bit by saying, okay, at least 3 points. So just the outbreak of violence can't do it alone. And they've widened the horizon to 3 years. So if anywhere in a period of 3 years you gain at least 3 points, it's a democratization. Mansfield and Snyder have taken a different approach, and they've not looked very much at the points in the polity indicator, but at the categories. You're either democracy, anocracy, or autocracy in polity. And they say if you switch between the categories somewhere within 5 years, you're democratizing if you're moving upwards. All of these have some disadvantages and some advantages, but they're all very rigid. 2 points in some parts of the polity scale doesn't mean a lot. I assume you're probably all familiar with this indicator and how it works, but -10 is a full autocracy, as autocratic as you can be, and +10 is as democratic as you can be. If you're at -10 and you change by 2 points, you're at -8, you're still a fairly vicious autocracy. And you can change by another 2 points to -6, and you're still within the autocracy category for a polity. So It felt a little too rigid for us, specifying exactly how many points. So what we wanted to do is, and this is the paper I wrote with my two PhD supervisors, JPR 2010. We wanted a process that eliminates small irrelevant changes and focuses on the big changes in the indicators. And it should work not just with polity, but with other indicators as long as they have a large enough range of values. So what we did is we developed a two-step process where first you identify periods of stability. And for some countries, you just get one period of stability. It'll be roughly democratic or roughly autocratic or some sort of mixed regime for its entire history since World War II or decolonialization. But if you have more than one period of stability, you compare the stable periods. And if one stable period is much higher than the preceding period, that's a democratization for us. So here's a graphic representation how we did this with a polity indicator. Basically, we define a band of variability that is acceptable to us. For polity, we've made it 4 points, 2 points up and down, because, as I said, the autocratic category is -10 to -6. The democratic category is +6 to +10. So that's basically a 4-point change where you're not changing your category at all. And we didn't want a country that is a -10 autocracy, hop up to -6 and be called democratizing, because it's not. Obviously we've tested the robustness to different sizes of the bands. And we've tried this with different indicators, polity and SIP foremost. And basically what the process does, it goes through the entire time series of the indicator for the country. It establishes these stable periods. As long as you always stay within 4 points of all of the other points, it stays a stable period. But sometimes you might have missing data. There might be an interregnum period or a period of political reform where you can't classify the new regime yet. At which point you get 2 stable periods, but if the outcome is roughly the same as the preceding period, it's not a democratization anyway. Only if there is a substantial hop upwards in a new period would we call it a democratization. And this even works if there's multiple intermediate and sometimes inconsistent observations where maybe the institutional development meanders a little, goes towards more democratic and less democratic. Sometimes we see these revisionist movements. We skip these short-term changes. We only focus on the stable periods. And with this, we've essentially replicated Mansfield and Snyder's result, despite the fact that this sorts out a lot of the small democratizations of 2 points, 3 points. This chart here shows the probability of civil war onset in periods of democratization vis-a-vis your starting point on the polity scale. So if you're fully autocratic, if you're fully democratic, obviously there shouldn't be any observations at the far end of the scale here. And the dashed line here, that's the confidence interval of what the likelihood of, the probability of civil war onset is. The narrow line here, that's all the country years where there's no regime change. So you see it clearly falls even outside of the confidence interval. So we remain confident in Mansfield and Snyder's original finding that civil war onset is a higher risk during democratization periods. I'm not showing the table here because we'll have a similar table in a moment if you want to see the indicators. Now, knowing this, let's focus on what drives this. And one thing that's been very much at the forefront of the discussion is the influence of elites. Specifically in reaction to things like the Balkan Wars, where entire shelves in the library were written about these case studies from several different points of view. And the two endpoints here are, if you're in the agent structure debate, it's all structure or it's all agent. You have ethnic security dilemma, which basically says it's the potential threat of being attacked that leads you to prepare for an attack, and that looks threatening to others, and you get into a cycle where everybody gets more and more afraid of their neighbors. And we have elite manipulation, where leaders selfishly create conflict. I actually had some charts for this, but I presume this is relatively well known. For elite manipulation or elite persuasion, Philippe Gagnon Jr. has written a beautiful study of the Balkan Wars of the early 1990s, where he goes back into surveys and studies done in Yugoslavia before the end of the Cold War, where people were asked things like, what's your identity? Do you feel Yugoslav or do you feel Croat, Serb, Bosniak, Slovene? And he pulls out these findings and shows, okay, the Yugoslav identity dimension was strongly, was dominant, certainly bigger than the individual smaller group identities. And this was, of course, something that the Yugoslav state in itself had promoted for a long period before the leadership figured out that it's easier to divide and rule. So in the early 80s or in the late 70s, they suddenly stopped promoting the Yugoslav identity very much. But it carries forward all the way into the early 1990s until we have people like Franjo Tudjman or Slobodan Milosevic who make appeals to a narrower identity. And Gagnon very much argues that it's these people where we should be putting the blame. It's them convincing the masses that what matters is not that we're all Yugoslavs, but what matters is that I'm a Croat, your neighbor is a Serb, and he might be threatening to you. Posen did also, he studied the same case, he came with the exact opposite conclusion. He argues it's ethnic security dilemma. It works exactly as in IR. You're scared of your neighbor, so you get yourself a knife or a gun or something. Just in case your neighbor goes berserk, you want to protect your family. But of course, your neighbor picks up on this and it's like, okay, my neighbor just bought a gun. You know, what kind of a person is this? Do I need to be afraid? So, you know, you also get yourself a gun. So you get into this cycle where you can start with a country with clearly distinct identities. And one side gets more worried and they start to prepare and circle the wagon a little bit. And that's, of course, a signal the other side does the same. And so you divide what used to be one country with a, basically shared identity dimension into separate categories, and you get into almost an arms race that at some point escalates into violence. And Posen stresses time and again that you don't need anybody with malicious intent for this to work. You can all just be concerned for the safety of your family and you still get into violence. So he would say you don't need leaders to whip the population into a frenzy. You don't need people to think that their neighbor is necessarily evil, or it has a nice, it's the structure that drives this. Now the thing is, both of these have been proposed as explanations of why democratization is more likely to have a civil war, but the problem is neither of them actually addresses democratization periods. Elite manipulation can happen whenever elites feel threatened. And if you want to go back to Yugoslavia and look at Slobodan Milosevic in power later on and links to the Kosovo War, you might say, okay, there wasn't really a democratization movement the second time around, but he mightn't have made the elections, so it's convenient to create another conflict. So it's not exactly specific. It shouldn't explain why democratizations are more problematic. And the same goes for the ethnic security dilemma. That just happens whenever there's no overarching protecting third party that can assure everybody that they're safe. So in areas of state failure, for example, you would expect this to work just as well. Again, it doesn't explain why democratizations themselves should be the part to worry about. So instead, what I proposed was it's a combination, it's a synthesis of these two that relies on the fact that you have strong political competition, much stronger during democratization than during later periods of a country's history, combined with ethnic divisions. Virtually all of the countries we still have are ethnically heterogeneous. Virtually all of the countries that we have still to democratize in any way have very well-established ethnic boundaries. So you have these ethnic divisions, they're already given to you, and you start the political competition. And the way this would work is, if you democratize, you have to figure out what the demos is. Rule by the people requires a definition of the people. And that means, and you need to do this, and you can't do it in a democratic way because of the chicken and egg problem. So you need to have some sort of social agreement on, these are the insiders, these are the people that we're going to share political power with, and these are possibly the outsiders. And this agreement is, obviously it's done at the national level by the political elites, but it's also something that every inhabitant will be thinking about themselves, whether they actually want to live in a country with, this other group X. And if you have a history of politicizing ethnic divisions, then it becomes much harder for the population to say, yes, I trust the other group. Because, okay, no, previously they've used ethnicity to exclude us from power. Maybe that you were discriminated as a group. Or even worse, maybe you were discriminating another group, and you're afraid that, they're coming for you if you have to share power with them. Now, this plays at the same time as political competition sets in, and the literature tells us first elections are always, well, not necessarily disorganized, but they're certainly ferocious because the political party landscape hasn't shaken out yet. You have all of these, political arena gets opened, all of these new parties and contenders enter the political arena. And the non-viable parties, they haven't had their electoral defeat yet. They haven't lost 2 elections in a row and given up or merged with another party or whatever. So in the first elections, you have a very wide field. A lot of people competing for power, looking for the limelight to try and make them their campaign message to the population. And of course, if you try and attract attention, one of the easiest ways, one of the most basic ways you can get people to pay attention is through messages of fear. And this is where these two come together, because if you have a history of using ethnic divisions for excluding people or discriminating people, and you're running an election campaign with this historical baggage, and you need to grab the attention of the electorate, this is the easiest message you can make, and it's a hard message to avoid. If you're running for political office on a 5-point economic stimulus plan, and your competitor says you really have to worry about your neighbor because your neighbor might attack you in the dark of the night, you have to talk about this. If you're not talking about this, you run the risk of sounding completely out of touch, completely irrelevant to some very serious concerns. So once this genie is out of the bottle, it's very hard to get the discourse during the election campaign back to more substantial issues. So I've tried to test this in a quantitative large N setting. Basically, for each of these steps, I have one hypothesis. Theoretically, democratization should be associated with higher risk of civil war. That's just replicating what we've already seen. The presence of politicized ethnic divisions should be associated with a higher risk of civil war. And I needed some way of capturing intense election campaigns. And the way I've done this is I've argued the most intense election campaign is when you have an incumbent who feels threatened because the incumbent has access to the media landscape like nobody else. Just like you're challenging a sitting president, the president comes to town with Air Force One, you have, it's a completely different ballgame. So here too, basically I'm trying to measure ferocity of the election campaign by determining when an incumbent is particularly threatened and most likely to seize the megaphone and try and rile up the population. Obviously, there's no good indicator for threats of incumbents. So I've finagled one. It's a flawed process. Feel free to attack me for this. You might know the Archigos data set, which records the fate of leaders. It tells you how they got into power and how they got out of power, and if they were punished for what they did during their tenure. And I would argue that basically there's two events that the incumbent would be much worried about, both of which are very relevant if you're trying to democratize a formerly autocratic regime. And that's, first of all, getting forcefully removed from power, irregularly removed, instead of just an election, a coup d'etat, assassination attempt, etc. And finally, and again, this is for autocrats highly relevant, getting punished for what you did during your tenure. I don't think incumbents would be worried about getting removed from power in a regular manner by losing the elections, because we all know, and many of the countries that we would be studying have this pattern that you lose the election, you come back in the next election, and you have another chance at it. If you get removed in a regular manner, you can also get back in a regular manner. If you're removed by a coup, or much more obviously, if you're removed by assassination, kind of hard to get back in. So I've tried to figure out which factors signal that an incumbent should be worried about based on the country's history and the incumbent's own characteristics. Doesn't matter how long the person is in office. It doesn't matter if he's a complete autocrat and there's no constraints on the executive. Age, gender doesn't play a role. I've tried a number of others that I'm not showing here. What really matters is this currently a transition process? Doesn't matter if it's a democratization. Any change in the institutional structure of the country might be a threat. And prior occurrence. It has a negative sign because it's years since the last prior occurrence, because you're much more worried if it happened to the guy right before you than to some guy 40 years ago. So these two indicate when the incumbent should be willing to up the ante. And then this is where we get into logit, country year regression, civil war onset as the dependent variable. I've limited it to only countries where ethnicity is already politically relevant. So we're not comparing countries that are as homogeneous as they can possibly be. Yes?
Could you also say how you operationalize politicized ethnicity?
Yes, I'm using the ethnic power relations data set, which was produced by UCLA and ETH Zurich. They did an expert survey of all the countries since 1945 to current years. They coded the size of all ethnic groups and a couple of other parameters, and specifically the access to political power, which can range from being basically a monopolist, senior partner, junior partner, local power, and then you get into being excluded from power or even being persecuted and discriminated. And I've operationalized politicized ethnicity as, as any time the ethnic dimension is used to exclude somebody. So you don't even have to persecute them, just keeping them out of government, for example, because they're part of group X triggers this, and it's a dummy variable. Mm-hmm. Right. So what you see is this is a subset, but again, only in countries with where ethnicity is already politically relevant. You see that democratization does what it's supposed to do. You add politicization of ethnicity doesn't affect the size or significance of the democracy indicator, and also has an increasing effect on the likelihood of civil war onset. And then you add the threat to the incumbent. It slightly overlaps with democratization because any regime type change is in here. Of course, this is a subset. So democratization shrinks a little bit in the effect. I realize this is not a strongly significant indicator. It's still significant at the 5% level, but there are some methodological issues with this indicator. But for the moment, if we sidestep this, we do see that all three of these factors do play a role. The first two are basically about the structure. The last one is about somebody really wanting to push the political competition in a particular manner. And that has a comparably sized effect on a comparably sized increase on the likelihood of civil war onset. Now, if we agree that politicians can ignite violence, you could also say we should test the opposite. We should test whether political elites are able to prevent violence by broadcasting a unifying, calming, reassuring message. Certainly, if we're somewhere in the agent structure debate and we say we're very much on the agent side, we say elites manipulate the population into creating conflict for their selfish goals, they should have the option of doing the opposite. Otherwise, we can't fairly say that they are to blame. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to find a case where comparatively benevolent, careful political elites try to manage a democratization process in a way that keeps the country stable and peaceful despite previous history of ethnic violence. And these cases aren't that frequent. You don't see a lot of political leaders really trying to keep the country this stable. That's also because a lot of democratizations start with the removal of the leader in the first place, leaving you without a figurehead to manage the transition easily. Burundi between 88 and 93 is one of these cases that is, the perfect, beautiful textbook example of, this is how you should be democratizing. It also ends in a brutal civil war with over 200,000 victims. So it's a beautiful case, but it's thoroughly depressing. Quick background on Burundi. Almost immediately after decolonization, we have the minority ethnic group, the Tutsi, seize power, and then we have a 3-generation military dictatorship. It's not it's not the typical military dictatorship, but it has periods of brutal state repression against the majority. And to give you an idea of the size difference, the Tutsi, who are basically the ruling ethnic group, are 14% of the population. And the Hutu, who they're ruling over, are 85% of the population. So it's a massive size imbalance. What I've done here is I've tried to collect as many sources as I can. You could criticize this by the sources alone already, but there's not a lot of easily available documentation on these cases, unfortunately. I've used everything that Reuters has, anything from the local news that was picked up by BBC Monitoring and is therefore archived and accessible, and expert studies done previously on this case, including Rentians, who starts actually in the year of the elections and the outbreak of the civil war, and then over 10 years into the future on this. And I find basically 4 distinct periods of the democratization that highlight the limitations of the power of political elites to stop a campaign of violence. It actually starts with ethnic violence. Buyoya has taken power just a couple of months before this. There's an uprising in one of the districts of the country, and this being very much towards the end of the Cold War. There's a lot of international pressure to say, okay, this is enough. You guys been in power for over 2 decades. It's time to open the political arena and democratize. He doesn't have access to easy backup from the international community, the Soviet Union or US, who would fund him and keep him in power no matter what he does. So the international community really does put on the pressure. But it doesn't look like it needs a lot of convincing. He's in power for a couple of months. He seems thoroughly convinced of the need to actually change the way the country is run. And you see this by his almost immediate reaction. He turns what is basically a dictatorship into a government of national unity with equal representation for the Hutu and for the Tutsi in very short order. By the way, I'm ignoring the 1% minority, the Twa, because they don't politically matter in this very much. So you have a Committee on National Unity, which gets busy in a moment. All of the government is really evenly split, with Buyoya being a Tutsi president. He gets himself a Hutu prime minister, splits the ministries 50-50 between the two ethnicities. And then he goes and actually physically travels to every single district in the country to try and speak to the population about the need for national unity. And that's why I think it probably didn't need a lot of convincing if he's willing to go this far. He could have made a half-hearted attempt, and the international community would probably not have cared enough to push him further. But he really tries to do what's right here. What's interesting is that there are naysayers. There are people who are opposed to this on both sides, both the Hutu who've been oppressed for over 2 decades and some of the more radical people on the Tutsi side. They don't mess with the debate. They really stand back and let this thing happen. There's not a lot of voices campaigning against this on either side. So it really looks like the political arena is actually changing the way it's supposed to be changing in a positive sense. And Buyoya and his government managed this process thoroughly carefully. They don't start with elections. They don't even start with a constitution. They start with a basic document that serves as a foundation for the constitution, the Charter of National Unity, which is worked out by this Committee on National Unity, evenly split with respected members on both sides. And then they take this charter and they put it to a referendum, and there's massive response from the population, over 90% participation, over 90% approval for this Charter of National Unity. So it looks like everybody's getting the message and is willing to go along with this process. This is accompanied by an intense promotion campaign where members of the government do travel around and keep talking to the population and seek to actively engage. Then they take their Charter of National Unity, they write a constitution. The constitution is again put to a referendum, and again you have over 90% participation, over 90% approval from the population. So it's a very, very strong signal that people go along with this. And while the executive has already been formed, they're working through all organs of the state to try and ensure equal representation, without any elections, just top down, try and make it as accessible as possible. Except this is the seed for what comes later, except for the state organs that have actual military force, the police, the military. And you see that not only aren't they opened up, but they stay with their same patterns. There's a protest in one of the districts, they crack down, just like under the military dictatorship of old. And they don't target So, you know, if there's rebels in a particular province and they were to at least target their response to only the people who stir up trouble, you might get away with it. But no, they use indiscriminate violence, hits a lot of the civilian population. So this is the one cloud on the horizon. And you do see that even though the extremists don't engage on a political level, they try to stop this process by making a coup attempt, an assassination attempt on Buyoya, to basically roll this back to the beautiful way things used to be when, you know, only one side was in power. All of this doesn't derail the process. So from 92 to 93, we prepare for the elections. So the constitution is approved, national unity is literally littered throughout the articles. Almost every single section there's big references made to national unity. The two political parties that have been around, well, let's say one political party in a rebel organization under military dictatorship representing the Tutsi and Hutu populations, run a very inclusive political campaign. They don't campaign as we're the Hutu party or we're the Tutsi party. As a matter of fact, if they make any reference to ethnicity, they campaign on saying we're the party for everybody versus the other party is the exclusive mono-ethnic kind of party. So it's, you know, this is actually what you would like to see after 2 decades of military dictatorship and repression towards the majority of the population. And as a result, the elections, you know, they're very calm. Nothing unexpected happens. As a matter of fact, the international community has literally stopped caring by this point. Most of the media doesn't even cover it anymore because we're all thinking, yeah, this thing is in the bag. The voting does not follow any ethnic divide. You see Tutsi voting for the Hutu party and Hutu voting for the Tutsi party. It really isn't an ethnic division at this point. And a pleasant surprise, not just political leaders, but also leaders of the military step forward and say, we accept the result, we respect the election outcome, we call for calm. The new government, there is a change of power. Basically, the former Hutu party comes to power, and they do the right thing. Again, they make a government of national unity. They invite the Tutsi back to the table, equally split between the two ethnic groups. And in a very smart move, they appoint heads of the police and the military that are neutral. They're neither Hutu nor Tutsi, because you want to send the message to both sides. It's, you know, the military is no longer Tutsi controlled. Instead, we have somebody who is neutral. And you want to send to the Tutsi the message, the military is now not a Hutu organization that will, you know, make you pay for what you did. So it's exactly as you would want it to be. You have 2 elections, new president comes to power, everything proceeds, except despite the reassuring noises from absolutely everybody, you see that some parts of the police and the military start to get into this dynamic of we're afraid of what's going to happen to us. They radicalize, and almost immediately the parliamentary and presidential elections are a couple of weeks apart, both in June. And the first coup attempt against the new president is in early July. It's an almost immediate reaction, at this point by a very small minority. And this minority grows, and then you start to see indiscriminate killings against the Hutu by Tutsi parts of the police and military starting in September. And then finally they have a second successful coup attempt in October, at which point this descends into civil war almost immediately. So the takeaway from this case is that even if literally everybody in the political landscape tries to keep the process as calm as possible, you may not be able to outrun the historical baggage that exists or the divisions that exists in the minds of people. And the people who escalated this aren't necessarily, they weren't political leaders. They might have been relatively high in the hierarchy of the military, but not clearly identifiable figureheads. Instead, this is mid-level people deciding to take things into their own hand. So very depressing message at the end. That may force us to think about, how much power can we actually attribute to political elites in this setting, if even in 5 years of concerted effort, they can't avoid an outcome like this. Now the final part. Running a little bit over, I'm sorry. Typical European academic, sorry. The final part is we think we have it sewn up. We think we know what happens with democratizations. We're convinced that the risk is higher. But there's two problems that affect any of the studies that we've done, independent of which indicator we're using. And they may cause us to have a different case than we think we're having. The first part is, obviously, for us to code something as a democratization, some indicator has to change noticeably so that we can say, okay, this is how we code it. So we're only getting the cases that are sufficiently successful that somebody doing the yearly update of the indicator says, yes, this is worth more points. Probably not that much of a threat to the result, because these are the most viable cases. They survived to the end of the year and somebody coded them as strong enough. So they're probably the best chance we have of seeing a real democratization. But the second part is, of course, political violence and democratization go hand in hand. They occur simultaneously. And Burundi might be an outlier because the people who wanted to end the process waited till after the election. If your country is democratizing and you don't like where it's going, you might take things into your hands much earlier in the process. And you may even need violence to remove the autocrat who was in power before. So we might see violence a lot earlier. And the way we've been dealing with this is, in the quantitative studies, of course, is we've excluded all of the cases where there's an ongoing conflict. And we've lagged our indicators by a year, so there's no possible overlap. The violence had to come after the political change. So we're only examining a subset, and we're missing a couple of important cases. This is the development of Polity 4 for Burundi. This, by the way, here is 1990 till about 97, where there's nothing. Because there's a managed transition process till 93, and then there's a civil war after. This indicator never changed. This wasn't a democratization attempt, despite the fact that these guys put 5 years into it. Here we have Pakistan, which had a similar event in the late 60s, where they opened the political arena, and the people who used to be in power didn't like the outcome. So it descends into a civil war, and as a result, we actually get Bangladesh a couple of years later on the international scene. Again, you don't see any of this because we're not capturing it. And of course, the best case is Yugoslavia, where, okay, so here we have the 1990s. We all know that these countries were democratizing. It's not like it wasn't all over the news. You don't see it in the indicator, because all of these changes are happening at the level of the republics. So as Croatia that was democratizing, as Serbia that was democratizing, as Bosnia that was democratizing, the federal Yugoslav state didn't do any democratization. So again, we're missing it. I do think we're leaving out key cases. So because either there's missing data, we haven't coded it at all, as we saw with Burundi or with Pakistan, or it happens at a level where it's not captured, as in the case of Yugoslavia, or the conflict breaks out too soon, and the democratization is undone before we can code it. And so we might not have the cases that we think we have. We have a peculiar subset that might behave roughly in the same way and that generates the results that we're looking at, but we can't be too sure. So what we're currently starting to do is a mixed method, quantitative and qualitative approach, where we use these fabulous new data sets that we have, armed conflict location and event data set, ACLED, or the UCDP geocoded event data set, which gives us almost day-to-day resolution of what happens in these conflicts. So we don't have to look at yearly indicators. We can see what happens in terms of violence for this entire period. And if you look at these, all these data sets, they cover Africa. It's probably one of the really depressing takeaways is that the one area where we have excellent data on Africa is unfortunately violence. We don't have this level of resolution data for any other world region. We see three patterns if you ignore the countries that are peaceful throughout the entire period. We see countries where the violence subsides after democratization, which is kind of what we're hoping for. We see countries where violence appears or increases after democratization. We see countries where it just keeps going. There's violence before, there's violence after, there's no noticeable change. And then there's a couple of cases where you see all of these patterns in one go. Right, here's a chart that I've created for the purpose of this presentation. I realize it's a little, it's hard to see, so I'll explain. We have the polity indicator here. The cases where we would officially code a democratization are where we have a little dotted line. Seems to make intuitive sense in the case of Liberia. And what we have here is data from UCDP GED. This data set requires a fatality for an event to be registered. So it's the most restricted data set. A lot of the other data sets, they cover protests and rallies and riots where nobody might have gotten killed. They really need a dead body on the ground. Upwards is number of events per day. There's not that much. It goes to about 5. Downwards is number of fatalities, which goes to 1,000 per day. And what you see here is in Liberia, you have a lot of violence clearly to the first democratization attempt. And it's not a very far-reaching democratization attempt. They get a policy score of 0, exactly in the middle between democracy and autocracy. And that keeps it peaceful for a bit. So it looks like everybody's biding their time to see, if this actually works out, if this is a beneficial change. Then we have a resumption of the violence, and we have a second attempt, and from that point forward, it actually stays peaceful. And this is a much more substantial change towards democracy. We get a clear democracy score here from polity. So this is the kind of cases that we would like to have. And then you have, of course, this is DRC, where you see, for a large stretch, we have the 1990s and the 2000s here. For most of the 1990s, you basically have the African World War surrounding the DRC. You see enormous amounts of violence, consistent across many years, really. And then we have the agreement, the peace agreement, combined with the democratization, reaches a level that we haven't seen before in the country. And the violence not only keeps going, but it gets much worse. And well, unfortunately, our data set cuts out here. But this is the kind of cases we code the end of the civil war, internationalized civil war here. So in our previous study, this would have shown up as a case of, this is peaceful to some extent. Because the war ended here, you had a democratization, doesn't get coded as a civil war again right away. So it looks like, okay, these guys worked out in our previous study, and instead what is this actually is a worsening of the situation. Then you have cases that don't seem to show a particular pattern. This is Kenya. And Kenya has episodes that recur of inter-ethnic violence. It's not the kind of one ethnic group versus the government violence. It's one ethnic group against another ethnic group, and it doesn't get coded as a civil war in any way. So this would have looked like a peaceful democratization as well. But what you see is that a lot of these events actually coincide with elections. The big set here. The scale here is up to about 60 dead per day. So it's not as harsh as some of the previous cases, but it's still substantial body counts over time. This is the 2007 election. So again, we wouldn't have found this case in our previous large N studies. It wouldn't have shown up in any combination of indicators. But it's clear that the violence follows a democracy-related pattern because we have this almost immediately after the election. And obviously we had a recent election which stayed moderately quiet, thankfully. There's a 2002 election that coincides with the democratization attempt that also stayed very, very quiet. So there is something going on with the democratization, but we're not capturing it. And of course, the case we started with, Burundi, where, as I mentioned, we don't have any data here. It's not coded. This was the first democratization attempt. This is the civil war. They try and fix it. It just keeps going. They try and fix it again. It keeps going and takes a while to taper off. So now that we have this much more detailed data, we're seeing very different patterns from what we would anticipate based on the previous large N country year kind of studies. So what we're doing now is, one is a quantitative study of these day-to-day patterns, and the other is a series of individual case studies where we try and disentangle violence that is clearly related to democratization, because people are unhappy with the institutional changes being proposed, or people are worried that they're being left out from share of resources, access to power, ability to teach their kids their own language, etc. And violence that used to be there already, because maybe there's two different ethnic groups that have been going back and forth for a long time repeatedly. You might democratize and might turn worse afterwards, but it's not all of this is caused by the democratization. Some of this violence was already there. It was just below our radar. So we hope that with a series, we're aiming to complete about 8 case studies by this summer, that we have a better look at what's actually going on there. Right. Okay, sorry for going a bit over time. Truly sorry. Thank you so much for your attention. Please, any questions, any comments would be much appreciated.
So I'll start. So many of the people in this room are bureaucrats, will be teaching bureaucrats, will work with bureaucrats. And what you're talking about is fascinating because some of the, and this is quite different than what we might normally hear. And yet, when you think about some of the kinds of work that people in this room are interested in, it is with bureaucracies.
Mm-hmm.
It may be in decentralized fiscal systems. It might be working with the equivalent of the U.S. Agency for International Development. It might be working on issues of security sector reform, working in post-conflict environments, thinking about how to manage contractors in environments where there is considerable violence, and it's contractors and institutional civilians, maybe from something like the equivalent of a Ministry of Defense or a Ministry of Interior, or uniformed personnel that are working to try to help train and institutionalize governance. And so I'm wondering, you know, when we listen to this, I think it certainly gives me a very different perspective on some of the challenges we have when we look at countries across the income spectrum. Some of our increasing work is with middle income, but certainly with you know, developing countries. How should we, as people who think and work on and study and teach bureaucrats, like, what's the applicability for this lesson here on political violence and democratization? So you talk about elites. We might be able to sort of relate to elites like in the army, or, I mean, even in the United States, we don't have anything like a national constabulary, right? We don't have like the French or the Italians. But how might we think about this? I mean, in an applied kind of policy environment.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously this all came from a bit of policy advice saying, you know, watch out with the democratizations. It's not as delightful as you might want to, you know, hold back on democracy promotion a little bit, or be more careful about it. I think the top level takeaway might be it's also not as bad as we're thinking it is. And from some of the early work on the cases, there's some policy advice that we could give to people who work in development or aid agencies, or, you know, in the national ministries. And that is, for one, of course, slowing down the process. The second is transparency generates more trust, and you know, it's not, these aren't counterintuitive. This isn't particularly new, but it looks like these cases seem to all go into this direction. That, okay, it doesn't matter so much. The specifics don't matter so much as long as it's clear what's happening, as long as the population can see that, you know, one group isn't being disadvantaged vis-a-vis another group. So this fairness or even-handedness of the approach is one thing. The second part is who are you dealing with during a regime type change? And most of the time, and that's what happened in Burundi, the top level might get swapped out, but, you know, even leading bureaucrats in the ministries might be the same people. So there's a lot of continuation of the same kind of people doing roughly the same kind of policies, and that is problematic. But there's no easy solution to this that we could package as a policy advice, because you can't swap out these people. And there are cases, if we think back to Germany and Japan after the Second World War, one of the smartest decisions was to say, okay, we persecute, say, the top 4 levels of the hierarchy, and everybody else gets to stay on board, and you kind of co-opt them into the system. So, you know, there are cases where this works out perfectly, and you get a stable, prosperous democracy in exchange. But in these cases, the cases where it works, Germany, Japan, they were all roughly homogeneous. Here, if you have power divided and interests divided by ethnicity already, and this is basically the shape of the institutional landscape, you may have to swap out people in some way to assure that this works out. We've seen it in Burundi where they've really gone through all of the institutions, and they tried to make sure that at least 50-50 representation is achieved before they even go anywhere near an election, and it hasn't worked out in any case. And the reason why it hasn't worked out is because the 2 institutions where they didn't do it were the ones that were decisive in the end.
So in your current research project, or at least with the data set that you guys are kind of compiling, are you still interested in looking at that threat to incumbent variable? Because it seems like in cases like Kenya, where you have some more granular data about the conflict, you may be able to tease out some of those variables a little more.
Exactly. I don't think we'll come back to the threat of the incumbent. This is basically, it was an easy fix to getting an indicator that one can produce at a large and global level. As soon as we're dealing with the actual cases with day-to-day information from various sources, it's so much easier to judge the ferocity of the electoral campaign, and also which message follows which. You know, who starts talking about fear first? How does this spread? It gets so much easier to do this, so we don't have to do something as, you know, clumsy as the threat to the incumbent variable over there.
So, one thing I didn't hear you talk too much about, I'm just curious. So in a lot of these situations, there's the problem of international presence. And either lack thereof, we're not paying attention to it, or we're paying a lot of attention to it, and how that's going to sway elites, as well as the population. Have you thought about trying to account for either peacekeepers, economic sanctions, observers, things like that, and how that's going to affect how democratization is going to lead to violence or not?
Right. We're trying to integrate it through case selection. We're trying to have some cases in all of the categories where there's no strong international involvement, or at least, that it's limited to diplomatic and maybe development aid kind of levels versus actual boots on the ground involvement. And we don't have the kind of results yet where I could say what the influence is, but we have Paige Fortner who did her study on peace building, and she's gone through a number of cases, and I think her takeaways are immediately applicable. She's shown that peacekeeping produces short-term and long-term better chances of sustaining the peace, because you get into a environment where escalating the conflict is really expensive. And even small incidents, sometimes somebody is clumsy, or sometimes one soldier does the wrong thing and fires, or maybe there's even a traffic accident between two different groups and it escalates. With peacekeepers on the ground, they can calm this down. And as they stay, you get this dynamic that people start to focus more on the moderate parts of the political spectrum than on the radical sides, because cooperating becomes a viable strategy again. And that's why, after the peacekeepers leave, you have a longer lasting peace. Even if it goes back to war, the peace is longer, and the likelihood that it stays peaceful is longer. So hopefully we'll be able to confirm those results from our studies. But Paige Fortner's book has done a lot of legwork there. I don't think we can improve on the result, because she's been thoroughly careful. Yes?
I don't know a whole lot about this, so I apologize if it sounds a little strange. One of the things I've read a bit about is just the role of some of the sequencing and pacing with some of the IMF reforms or the World Bank kind of prescriptions for developing countries. And in the 80s and 90s having a pretty kind of rushing the job too quickly, and then you end up having this situation where there's collapse or government failure or whatnot. Is that something that's correlated, or that plays a role at all in some of the democratization of these countries? And if so, have you thought about it or looked at it much?
I agree that, to some degrees, this was a decade of cookie cutter advice that, it fits every country. This is how you should be doing it, and it doesn't fit every country, and as a result, some of the structures break down, or it contributes to problems. We don't see this as a driving force at this point. It clearly plays a role. It adds to things. If the population is expecting their government to do something, and you need to build trust in the new democratic institutions, and some of the advice actually disables the institutions from providing services to the population that would generate this trust, obviously it adds to the frustration, and it could add fuel to the fire. But it doesn't seem to be a driving factor. And I say this, full well that we're still very much in the middle of looking at these cases. But it doesn't seem that, implementing advice from abroad seems to be the first step in escalating. We'll see once we have the cases sewn up, where this is going.
I have a question regarding modeling, and you might have gone over it, I just missed it. But in terms of a falsification test, can you look at the decrease in democratization and say that leads to more stability? So just ask the question in the opposite direction. It's just a way to test the validity of your underlying assumptions.
We have tested whether the opposite movement carries a similar risk.
And what were those findings?
The findings were, as a matter of fact, autocratization also increases the likelihood of civil war onset. It does it in a different manner, and it does it less so because the nature of the movement is fundamentally different. If you try to seize power and make the country more autocratic, one of the first things you need to do is control the police and the military. If you succeed in this, you have the tools to squash any dissent that you face. So what we found for autocratizations is if there's any political violence, it comes within a year, possibly the same year or the next year after this attempt, while the new autocrat is still trying to consolidate power. If it doesn't come then, it's very unlikely that will happen later because basically the autocratization was successful. With democratizations, we saw the opposite. Usually you don't have violence right away because, and we saw this in one of the charts, people are biding their time, seeing if this system works for them. And they might, in the case of Burundi, they might wait 2 months and get impatient, or they might wait a year. We found that for democratizations, the first 3 years is the time window. In terms of the overall influence, which has the higher probability of onset, is democratizations.
And the mechanisms are different, and this is what you're arguing. That makes sense.
Precisely, yes.
So I'm wondering, going back to your middle model, so you had transition as an indicator of the leader being at risk, which seems sensible. But I mean, I'm worried. Yeah.
Right.
I think it was a slide before it.
Mm-hmm.
The third part of the model. Right. So, and when to have transition, there has to be a change. So part of this, and I think you can raise this later in the talks, is just endogenous. I mean, that it just has to do with how you define transition.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing, have you thought about trying to model the transition process and think about, are there things outside of these variables? So I'm an economist, and one thing that struck me is there's no economic variable here.
Mm-hmm.
So you might expect, for example, that that income inequality makes
Right.
transition more likely. I'm wondering if you can do things that look at, what's the probability that transition may occur, rather than did a transition occur? Because there might be cases where there is a risk of transition, but there wasn't an overthrow, so there was no change, and that didn't pick up here.
Right. We've done some models on trying to, forecast, okay, where would we expect a transition to occur? And unfortunately, because transitions are so varied in nature, we don't have a comprehensive model that explains, okay, the onset of a transition. The problem here is also that I think you said transition requires some change. In this variable, it doesn't. You could have a period of political uncertainty and you go back to exactly what it was before because the people who are in power reinforce their hold on power. So I think it would be interesting for us to model very different types of transitions separately. For coups d'etat, very hard to forecast because you only need a small group of insiders to pull off a coup d'etat. And it might be their personal dissatisfaction that's driving it, or their personal seeking power that's driving it, and there might be no coherent factors at the country level.
So there's no change necessarily, but
here there's not.
But there's still that uncertainty. So I guess the question is, given the way these are defined, could you have a period of certainty where then you see a regular removal? Can you observe the opposite in your data?
So, a period of basically stability and an irregular removal?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. And that's particularly, assassinations, if you just need one lone gunman, coups d'etat, where people like the system, but they'd like to run it. So these sorts of things you do see, and as long as we're just talking about transitions as the broadest category, it's very inconsistent as to what's driving it. But yes, we do, in our models in general, we throw in various conceptions, operationalizations of inequality and economic prosperity, development, even expectations of development in the future when we see, for example, enhanced school enrollment. The economy mightn't be going somewhere, but people are getting more training, they feel more confident about the futures. We've thrown these in, not a very coherent pattern. Sorry, it's a very dissatisfying answer. I'm sorry.
What's driving your selection of the cases for moving forward?
We want to, essentially, we want to make sure that we capture 4 categories. Hang on. We want to have the countries that are continuously peaceful. We'll try and take these as a baseline, match them up with comparable countries in the neighborhood that feature some of the same characteristics when it comes to economic development, ethnic makeup, maybe institutional legacies, and so forth. And then we want to compare these with countries where we see violence after, violence before, or continuous violence. And we want to make sure that we have these 4 captured. And if we can make sure, as I was saying before, then we would like to duplicate this for countries where there is actual boots on the ground. There's an international peacekeeping effort, even if it's a small, possibly undersized and under-mandated effort, vis-a-vis countries that are basically going it alone with diplomatic support and maybe financial support, but no actual physical involvement of the international community. So hopefully with this we capture the right sets of cases. We'd like to have at least 1 case in each box. Hopefully that works out.
I'm just struck by this. I mean, you know, like I'm thinking about all these factors and the multiple questions that have been raised, and you know, I'm thinking about Thailand, for example, right? There was democratization from military rule. There was an irregular removal, a coup d'etat. The president is expelled. There is political violence, but the population itself is largely homogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
It's an economically it's a middle income country, but that's part of the problem, is they've fallen into the middle income subsidy trap that economists worry so much about in terms of issues of inequality and moving up the value chain. There is a new president. She is the sister of the deposed president. There is strong political upheaval, very, very modest but controlled levels of political violence. There's no continuation of the violence other than it's kind of controlled within the capital, and there's violence in the 2 kind of stakeholder areas, the North and the South, which are economically disparate, right? The poor and the wealthy. You know, the government itself has not resorted to using the police or the army in a coercive, oppressive way for control. Is that the kind of case that fits into this? Is that an outlier because it has some of these characteristics but not others of these characteristics? I mean, you know, going to Dan's question about case selection, is that a case worth thinking about?
It is not a case we're thinking about, for the reason that we're a little bit lazy. And we're going for the cases that have a prefabricated division in the society. So Thailand, as you said, you know, basically a homogeneous country. And the divisions that are, at least ethnically, the divisions that are there in terms of the income groups are more malleable. You could conceivably move up from low income to middle income in this country. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's much easier than becoming a Tutsi if you're a Hutu before. So we're trying to focus on the cases where it's easy because there is a division there. And it's a continuously present temptation to the political leaders to use this easy prefabricated identity dimension that they can always go to. Other than that, it's not an outlier. There are cases, a number of cases that fall into this. And some of these even are cases that then turn into something we think of as an ethnic war. I'm thinking Lebanon in '75, when the civil war started, wasn't an ethnic civil war. It was the haves versus the have-nots, and that happened to align with ethnic dimensions and religious dimensions, but that wasn't, this wasn't what was driving it. But it can turn into, it can harden these borders so much that now it is clearly ethnically divided.
Because Judd's question before, kind of in an environment of one-size-fits-all, cookie-cutter approaches to economic liberalization, even in terms of policy guidance, regional institutions like the Asian Development Bank, which think a lot about integration, right? The kinds of things that Tatiana works on. I mean, they have a degree of ambivalence about how much do we continue to invest resource-wise in Thailand now, as opposed to maybe we should hold on and see, the reds and the yellows, how this plays out.
How this works out, exactly. I'm kind of hopeful that at least we'll have since we study the starkest cases, maybe some of this will be a message that you can take away and apply to countries which have different dimensions that divide the country and might pose a risk for conflict. But unfortunately, at this point, we don't even have the event data for this to study them. So this will be firmly in the box of future research, I hope.
Well, thank you so much for coming to present to us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks to you all. Thank you so much.